Warming up is an essential part of climbing if you want to get the most out of your session while also minimizing risk of injury. But before I talk about what I actually do during my warm-up session, I'm going to spend 15 seconds talking about why you should warm up. Warming up will get blood flow to your outer limbs, which will minimize your chance of getting pumped. When you're pumped, it's really hard to keep climbing. Most injuries are done on cold muscles, so by warming up your muscles, they are more pliable and thus less likely to get injured. Now let's actually talk about what you should do during a warm-up. There are actually two main objectives of warming up that you should keep in mind before going through the actions. One, heart rate. Two, actual body heat. Now when it comes to your heart rate, you should be targeting between 70 and 80% of your max heart rate. You can Google what your max heart rate is and there's a calculation for you, or you can check out heart.org. They have a basic table based on your age. It's not perfect, but it is a good idea of where you should be looking at. For me, I'm between 200 and 205, so 70% would be a heart rate of 140, and so I try to be between 140 and 160 throughout my entire warm-up. If you aren't familiar with how to do this calculation, just pull up the calculator on your phone and type in your max heart rate, and then you're going to multiply that by 0.7, and that gives you the baseline. So for me, 140 is the target, and you can do this again, 200 times 0.8, and that gives you 160. So I know that I need my heart rate to be between 140 and 160. To be able to do this, you need to track your heart rate. I use an Apple Watch, which I highly recommend. You can also use a Fitbit, Garmin. There's a ton of different brands out there, but the one I use is Apple Watch with a RedPoint app. That is a climbing specific app that tracks your heart rate while also tracking how far you climb, how many routes you do, how hard the routes are. In this case, we're looking specifically at your heart rate, so anything that tracks your heart rate. What I usually do is I check my heart rate every few minutes just to make sure that I'm staying within that target range. I'm not going too high, because if you go too high, you're gonna get pumped. And I'm not going too low so that I can make sure that I'm getting enough blood flow to the rest of the extremities of my body. Now for heat, you've probably seen a ton of professionals climbing with jackets on, and that's because warming up your body, you actually need to get warm, and one of the easiest ways to do that is to climb with a jacket on. So I usually climb with my jacket on during the warm-up, and then I take the jacket off before I start the rest of my climbing session. Climbers like Shauna Coxey, for example, in an interview with Red Bull recently, said that she uses a jacket and climbs until she is so hot that she is sweating. And that's a great indication that your body is warm enough. Now that you know what the objectives are for this warm-up, let's talk about what you're actually going to do. And there are two parts to the warm-up. One is the physical part and two is stretching. Now, I used to do jumping jacks and push-ups and treadmill, but I really enjoy climbing, and so I've adjusted this to fit the parameters needed, and I climb for 15 minutes or 1/8 of a climbing session. So I will usually climb between a V0 and V3. Ideally, you're climbing between 2 and 3 grades lower than your current skill level. If you're climbing at a V0, I'd recommend choosing 2 routes that maybe you've done before, or you do it and you just keep on doing that route over and over again. Do what you need to. If you have to, start doing push-ups, start doing sit-ups and running, whatever you need to do if you can't climb on V0s as a warm-up. For this part, I usually do a couple V0s, then I move to V1s, V2s, and a couple V3s. And really this is just based on preference, but I like to mix things around, so I'll do a V0, then a V3, then a V2, etc. And I also like to climb down from routes when I'm warming up. Oftentimes when we're done with a route, we're just jump off or go down to the climb down areas. But with warming up while lowering yourself is a great way to keep your body on the wall as much as possible. At this point in a warm-up, you don't need to be looking at the beta of a route. So even if it's a little bit tricky, you may find yourself stuck on a route. But like I mentioned in my video about climbing for relaxing during the warm-up, it's okay if you haven't read the beta, and because the exhaustion or the energy you're using staying on the wall is still going to promote your warm-up. For the most part, I like to warm up on slabs because this minimizes the pressure on my fingers and also really engages my legs and hips. Of course, you can do overhang climbs, and I will do those on occasion, but if your heart rate is skyrocketing or you're getting pumped, then you really need to make sure that you're going back to slab climbs, because getting pumped is the opposite of what you want during your warm-up. Now we're going to talk about the second part of a warm-up, which is stretching. Stretching is going to be an essential part of minimizing the risk of injury. I usually spend an equal amount of time that I did climbing with stretching. So if I'm climbing for 15 minutes, I'm stretching for 15 minutes. If I'm doing a shorter session that's only an hour long, then my warm-up is about 15 minutes long. So I'm usually about 7.5 minutes climbing, 7.5 minutes of stretching. I have recently heard people mention that you shouldn't stretch during a climbing session because stretching can minimize how much your muscles are able to flex because they're stretched out. However, when you aren't stretched out, you're more likely to get injuries like a hamstring pull or a rolled ankle because your muscles are too tight, and stretching will actually increase their pliability, which will decrease the chances of them getting injured. So if you like doing heel hooks, for example, make sure that you're stretching your hamstrings so you can minimize the risk of injury to your hamstrings. Now, of course, I like to stretch everything just in case, and I usually use my entire body. There are things for your joints as well. So wrists, for example, you can roll them around your knees, you can roll those around, and that just makes sure that everything's as clean as possible and ready to move in whatever direction you need to. The stretching side is pretty straightforward, but if you've noticed, your heart rate will drop during this point, and I find that's okay because my body stays warm and I'm able to get my heart rate back up to where I need to pretty quickly because I'm not able to fully recover during the stretching stage. However, if you're worried about that, you can do dynamic or active stretching. A lot of professionals prefer dynamic or active stretching because you're less likely to overstretch something when you're dynamically stretching it than you are when you are static stretching. So keep that in mind, whatever you need to do to stretch. And this will also probably keep your heart rate up. It won't be as high as when you were climbing, but it will keep it higher than if you're sitting on the ground stretching. So that is something to consider while you're stretching. Now that you're finished stretching, you can take off your jacket and go full steam into your climbing session. If you want to know what you should be doing during your climbing session after that warm-up, click on this playlist. I made a bunch of videos just for that. And if you want to know what YouTube thinks you'll enjoy, click on this video.